When I stood there on the balcony, holding a coffee that had long since gone cold, I saw him again, my sister's husband, emerging from the waves like something out of a dream I shouldn't be having. My own husband was just behind me, buried in his laptop, face lit by the cold glow of a screen. "You should come swim," my sister had said earlier. "It'll clear your mind." But it didn't. It only made the silence louder. I watched them laughing together, the wind pressing his shirt to his chest, and I felt something shift inside me. Not desire. Not yet. Just a quiet ache that I wasn't where I was supposed to be. I thought of how he'd touched my elbow lightly at dinner the night before, helping me with my chair. Just a courtesy, maybe. But maybe not. That moment looped in my mind as I stood still, invisible, the sea stretching wide before me. If someone told me back then that in just a few days I'd do something I promised myself I never would, I'd have smiled politely and looked away. But that morning on the balcony was the beginning of everything. Because what I didn't know was that my husband would leave for a work trip within 24 hours. And what I couldn't have imagined was how fast one innocent look could unravel years of loyalty. Before I tell you the truth I tried so hard to bury, leave a comment and let me know, have you ever felt something for someone you were never supposed to notice? It started like any other trip, or at least I told myself it would. We packed 2 modest suitcases, mostly for the weather, breezy linen, swimsuits I hadn't worn in years, a sun hat I used to love before it started feeling like a costume. The flight was early. My husband spent it flipping through email, fingers tapping endlessly across his screen. I stared out the window, pretending to sleep, measuring the clouds like slow-moving punctuation marks across the sky. It was our 10th summer together, but lately, I couldn't tell if the silence between us was comfort or distance. We were headed to the coast, to my sister's villa. She and her husband had invited us months ago. "It'll be good for all of us," she said. "A little reconnection time. Family. Laughter. Saltwater." I wanted to believe her. The last time we'd all been together was 2 years ago, at a holiday dinner where I spent more time setting the table than speaking to anyone. But now, as the taxi wound through narrow cliff roads toward their house, something about the air felt too still. Even the sea, glittering far below, looked like it was holding its breath. They greeted us warmly. My sister hugged me like she always did, tight and real, the way only she could. Her husband stepped forward with a broad smile, hand outstretched, but instead of taking it, I let myself watch his face for half a second longer than I should have. He hadn't changed much, still lean, with that calm kind of charm that made people trust him easily. I remembered how he used to make my sister laugh until she cried. She said once, half joking, that marrying him felt like marrying summer itself. I looked at them now, side by side in the doorway, and wondered when I had stopped associating marriage with light. My own husband lingered by the trunk, complaining softly about poor reception. "They really need to fix these cell towers," he muttered. I knew he wasn't talking to me. We unpacked in silence. Our guest room overlooked the sea, wide windows letting in the scent of salt and eucalyptus. I hung my dresses carefully. They looked too vibrant against the beige walls, colors I hadn't worn in years. I almost took them back down again. That evening, we sat outside on the veranda with wine and grilled fish. The air was warm but carried the promise of cooler nights. My sister lit candles along the railing. Her husband poured the wine and asked us how we'd been. I answered with generic things, busy, tired, same as always. My husband mentioned a new client. My sister nodded and leaned into her husband's side. It looked so easy. At one point, he turned to me and said, "You look different this year." In a good way. Just that. Simple words, offered with an easy smile. But something in my chest flickered like a loose wire. I don't even remember what I replied, something deflective, probably. But the echo of that sentence stayed with me the rest of the night. Later, while brushing my teeth, I caught my reflection in the mirror. Hair wind-tangled, sun just beginning to kiss my cheeks, eyes a little tired but alive. I hadn't seen myself like that in a long time. My husband was already in bed, reading some article about economic downturns, eyes darting left to right in the glow of his tablet. I climbed in beside him, careful not to disturb the sheets, and stared at the ceiling. His hand never reached for mine. The next morning, I woke early. The villa was quiet, except for the hum of insects outside and the occasional call of gulls overhead. I crept onto the balcony with my mug, letting the breeze play through my hair. That was when I saw him, my sister's husband, walking back from the shore, towels slung over one shoulder. He spotted me and waved. I waved back, too long, and felt something like embarrassment warm my face. He climbed the stairs with ease and said, "Couldn't sleep either?" I smiled. "Jet lag, maybe. Or maybe your body just knows it needs a break," he said. We talked for a while. About nothing and everything. The villa renovations. The flavor of local olives. The way the town had changed over the years. He had this way of looking at you like he was genuinely interested, not in what you were saying, but in the way you said it. I found myself laughing, then catching myself mid-laugh. He told me they'd recently taken up paddleboarding. "You should try it," he said. "It's like standing on your own little piece of ocean." Something about that phrase stuck. I wondered when I'd last stood on anything that felt like it was mine. When he left, I stayed there alone, staring out at the water. My husband shuffled in behind me a few minutes later. "You're up early," he said, rubbing his eyes. I nodded. "Just couldn't sleep." He kissed my temple absently and went to make his own coffee. I watched his back as he walked away. And then, without thinking, I reached out and touched the railing where my sister's husband had rested his hand. It was still warm. The air that morning was different. Not cooler, not warmer, just heavier somehow. Like the stillness before a storm, but without clouds. I sat with my legs pulled up to my chest on the end of a wicker bench, halfway between the breakfast table and the garden path. My sister had gone into town to buy fresh fruit. My husband was already buried in his laptop again, talking into his headset with the dull, flat voice he used for clients. I stared at the chipped edge of my coffee mug and wondered if anyone would notice if I just walked away and didn't come back. That's when he appeared again, my sister's husband, walking up the stone path, his sandals dragging slightly, like he wasn't in a hurry to reach anyone. He held a small plate of melon slices, one hand balancing the dish, the other shielding it from the wind. He smiled when he saw me, and without asking, he sat down across from me, placing the plate on the low table between us. "You didn't eat much last night," he said, gently pushing the fruit toward me. "I wasn't that hungry," I said. It wasn't a lie. I hadn't been. "Still, you should try this. It's from the market in town. Ripe enough to fall apart." I reached for a piece, feeling his eyes on me, not in a threatening way, not even flirtatious. Just attentive. The kind of attention that had become foreign to me over the years. I used to get that look from my husband, especially in our early years. But lately, if he looked at me at all, it was with the vague distraction of someone scanning a screen. We talked a little about nothing. The weather. The taste of the fruit. A joke about the stray cat that kept stealing bread from the outdoor kitchen. And then he asked me something I hadn't expected. "Are you happy?" I froze for a beat. Not because of the question, but because of how simply he'd asked it, as if it were the most natural thing to wonder about someone. I didn't answer right away. Instead, I chewed slowly, swallowed, and placed the half-eaten melon back on the plate. I don't know, I said finally. Some days, maybe. Other days, I feel like I'm disappearing. He didn't say anything at first. Just leaned back in the chair, eyes scanning the sky like he was reading something up there that I couldn't see. I get that, he said. Sometimes I feel like I'm stuck inside someone else's version of my life. That sentence hung between us, and I didn't want to ask what he meant. I already knew. In a way, we were both watching our lives play out from the sidelines, unsure how or when we'd lost our place in them. We sat there in silence for a while. Then he stood and said, "Come on. Let's take a walk. Just down to the cliffs and back." I hesitated, glanced at the house. My husband's voice still echoed faintly from inside. He was in another Zoom call. I doubted he'd even notice if I left. I followed him. The path to the cliffs was narrow and dusty, lined with wild grasses and tiny yellow flowers that looked too delicate to exist in this heat. The sea was louder here, crashing below us with rhythmic determination. I hadn't realized how much I missed this sound, the weight of it, the way it could drown everything else out. We walked without touching, without speaking for a long time. Just listening to the wind and the water. And then we reached a bend where the cliffs dropped off more steeply, and he stopped. "I used to come here alone," he said, looking out at the horizon. "Before we bought the villa, before the renovations. It looked more wild back then. Less curated." I nodded, not trusting my voice. He looked at me. "You seem far away lately. Even when you're here." I turned to face him. His eyes were steady, but not forceful. I could have looked away. I should have. But I didn't. "I feel like I've been in hiding," I said. "Like everything I used to be is somewhere buried under layers of what I'm supposed to be." "Maybe it's not buried," he said. "Maybe it's just been waiting for the right time." And then, we kissed. We kissed, and the world didn't stop spinning. There were no fireworks, no dramatic soundtrack. Just the warmth of another person's mouth against mine, the taste of melon still lingering, the scent of salt and rosemary in the air. I pulled away first. My hand went instinctively to my chest, as if I could press the moment back in and undo it. "This can't happen," I said. He didn't argue. He just nodded. "I know." We walked back slower than we came. We didn't talk. We didn't touch. But every step between us felt charged. I felt more awake than I had in months, maybe years. And more ashamed. Back at the villa, my husband was still on his call, gesturing with exaggerated boredom. I slipped past him, heart pounding. In the bathroom, I splashed cold water on my face, stared at my reflection. I didn't recognize the look in my own eyes. That evening, we all had dinner together again, me, my husband, my sister, and her husband. The four of us around the same table, passing dishes, sharing laughs, acting like the world was just as it had always been. But it wasn't. Something had shifted. Inside me. Between us. I could feel it every time his shoulder brushed mine. Every time our eyes met across the table for a fraction of a second too long. Every time I caught myself almost smiling at nothing. Later, alone in bed, I stared at the ceiling while my husband snored softly beside me. I thought about what had happened, how easily it had happened. How dangerous that ease was. And I knew, deep in the part of me I didn't like to visit, that this was only the beginning. The next day began with the same routine, a soft breeze pushing through the curtains, the call of gulls overhead, and the distant sound of cutlery clinking from the outdoor kitchen. I lay in bed for a while, eyes open, staring at the pattern of light on the ceiling. My husband stirred beside me, grumbled something about checking emails, then rose and disappeared behind his laptop once again. The hum of his voice in yet another video call blended with the sound of running water as I stepped into the shower, trying to scrub away what couldn't be rinsed off. My mind had been restless all night. The kiss had embedded itself in my thoughts like sand between skin and fabric, irritating, persistent, impossible to ignore. I'd run through every possible way to forget it, and every one led back to the same conclusion: I couldn't. Not because of what it was, but because of what it meant. Something had cracked open inside me, and the light that poured in wasn't something I could pretend not to see. By the time I joined everyone for breakfast, the table was already set. My sister was slicing strawberries with her usual efficiency, talking about the local market and asking whether we should visit the cliffs again or head into town. Her husband, he, stood across from her, refilling coffee cups. When his eyes met mine, there was nothing overt in his expression. Just the same polite neutrality he gave to everyone. But I felt it, this quiet thrum beneath the surface, like a wire pulled taut. I took my seat beside my husband, who barely glanced up. His toast was already half-eaten, and his phone vibrated with another notification. The conversation moved around me like a river around a stone. I nodded when spoken to, smiled when expected. But inside, I was elsewhere. After breakfast, my sister suggested a drive into the nearby town. "You and I haven't had time alone in ages," she said. "Let's go look at ceramics." I hesitated. The idea of being alone with her, knowing what I knew, made my stomach turn. But I agreed. Of course I did. Because saying no would have raised questions. Because it was the right thing to do. Because if I didn't, I might do something worse. The town was beautiful, sun-drenched stone, winding alleys, bursts of bougainvillea spilling over whitewashed walls. My sister led me through the market with ease, greeting vendors, pointing out shops she loved. I followed, laughing at her jokes, feigning interest in terracotta bowls and embroidered linen. She was radiant that day, glowing in a way I hadn't seen in years. And it hurt more than I expected. We sat for lunch at a small cafe under a vine-covered pergola. She talked about everything, her work, their plans to expand the guest house, even memories from our childhood. I listened, but I wasn't really there. Part of me kept flashing back to the way his hand had brushed mine the morning before. The way his voice had dropped when he asked if I was happy. The way we had kissed. At one point, she looked at me, serious. "You seem different," she said. I froze, a piece of bread halfway to my mouth. "Different how?" She shrugged. "I don't know." "Distant." "Distracted." Then she smiled. "Probably just the change of pace." I forced a laugh. "Probably." Back at the villa, my husband was gone, off to a nearby co-working space someone had recommended. My sister disappeared into her room for a nap. I wandered out to the garden, looking for something to do. That's when I saw him again. He was in the shed at the edge of the property, sorting through tools. I don't know what drew me there. I could have gone back inside, picked up a book, taken a swim. But my feet moved before I could stop them. He looked up when I entered. "Hey," he said casually, brushing dust from his hands. "Hey," I replied, standing awkwardly in the doorway. We didn't speak for a moment. The space between us was quiet, heavy. "About yesterday," he began. "No," I said quickly. "Let's not." He nodded. "Okay." But we didn't leave. I stood there, arms crossed, watching him pretend to organize things that didn't need organizing. And he stood there, pretending not to glance at me every few seconds. It was ridiculous, the performance we were both trying to maintain. We weren't strangers. We weren't innocent. But we were still pretending, because anything else would tip the balance too far. Then something shifted. a gust of wind slammed the door behind me, and I jumped. He stepped forward instinctively, catching the edge before it could close fully. Our hands met for a fraction of a second. We didn't speak. We just stood there, breathing the same air, knowing we'd crossed a line already. "We can't," I said softly. "I know," he replied. And then, again, we kissed. We kissed. And this time, it felt worse. Not because it was less passionate, or less meaningful, but because it was beginning to feel easy. Like something natural. And that terrified me. When we pulled apart, the silence between us was different, deeper, darker. "We have to stop," I said. "I know," he repeated. I walked out first, heart racing. My sister was in the kitchen when I returned, humming as she cut fruit for sangria. I smiled, poured myself water, and tried not to shake. That night, at dinner, we all gathered again. The table was lively. My sister talked about the town, my husband finally looked up from his phone long enough to tell a story about a client, and I tried to pretend. But something had changed. In me. In him. In everything. I caught his eye once across the table, just for a moment. And that was all it took. I was already in too deep. The next morning arrived too soon. I barely slept, only drifted in and out, the images of the previous day playing over and over in my head like a silent film I couldn't turn off. I kept trying to tell myself that what had happened didn't mean anything, that it had been a fleeting lapse in judgment, a mistake made in the haze of emotion and proximity. But even as I whispered those words in the darkness of the guest room, I knew they weren't true. My husband stirred beside me, stretched, then rolled out of bed without a word. He was already checking his emails as he made his way to the kitchen. The usual. His routine had become so familiar it was nearly invisible. I wondered if mine had too, if he saw me at all anymore, or just expected me to exist quietly alongside him like background furniture. I pulled on a long cotton dress and tied my hair up without bothering to brush it. My reflection looked foreign to me, somehow sharper. Not prettier, not younger. Just awake. It was unsettling. As I walked into the kitchen, my sister was preparing breakfast. She greeted me cheerfully and poured me a cup of tea. Her husband stood near the open window, peeling an orange, his back turned. I could feel him before I saw him. I didn't look directly at him, but I knew he knew I was there. "I thought we could take a walk through the Cove Trail this afternoon," my sister said. "It's shaded most of the way, and the views are lovely." I nodded. "Sure. That sounds nice." My husband declined, of course. "I've got back-to-back calls," he said, biting into his toast. So it was decided, just the three of us. Another perfect setup that didn't feel like it should be happening. I tried to suppress the knot forming in my chest, but it tightened with every passing hour. We left after lunch. The trail started at the edge of the property, winding through olive trees and low cliffs before curving down to a secluded beach. The air was rich with the scent of dry earth, pine, and salt. My sister led the way, chatting easily about the renovations they wanted to do next spring. I answered when prompted, laughed when she joked. But my mind was spinning. He walked behind me. I felt the space between us like a weight on my skin, his nearness electrifying, his silence louder than any conversation. At one point, I dropped my water bottle and bent to pick it up. He reached for it too. Our hands brushed. A pulse of energy surged through me. I snatched it quickly and moved ahead. We reached the cove after nearly 40 minutes of walking. The beach was empty, just smooth pebbles and driftwood, waves curling lazily against the shore. My sister spread out a blanket and kicked off her sandals. "I'll stay here and read," she said. "You two go explore if you want." She handed me a small towel and a bottle of sunscreen before settling in with her book. I hesitated for a beat, then began walking down the shoreline. I didn't invite him, but he followed anyway. We walked in silence at first. The only sounds were the crunch of gravel beneath our feet and the whisper of the sea. It should have been peaceful, but my nerves were raw, stretched to their limit. "I didn't think I'd see you today," he said finally. I glanced at him. "I didn't think you'd want to." He looked ahead, toward the horizon. "It's not about want. It's about knowing we're already too far in." I stopped walking. "Then why keep going?" He didn't answer right away. When he did, his voice was quiet. "Because I don't know how to stop." Neither did I. I turned to face him. The sun was behind him, casting his face in shadow, but I could still see the tension in his jaw, the tight line of his mouth. He looked like he was struggling just as much as I was. "We're playing with fire," I said. "I know." We stood there, the waves breaking at our feet. It would have been so easy to reach for him again. But I didn't. Instead, I turned and began walking back. By the time we returned, my sister was packing up the blanket. She smiled as we approached, oblivious to the storm swirling beneath the surface. "That was nice," she said. "I forgot how quiet it gets out here." On the way back, she walked ahead, phone in hand, texting with one of her kids. He and I lagged behind. I kept a safe distance between us, not because I didn't want to be close, but because I knew I wanted it too much. When we reached the villa, the air had shifted again, thicker now, heavy with tension I couldn't name. My husband was on a video call, pacing across the patio. He waved as we passed but didn't mute himself or step away. Business always came first. That evening, my sister decided to cook a full dinner. "Something special," she said, lighting candles and opening a bottle of wine. We all gathered around the table, the four of us, laughing at old stories, sharing bites of grilled vegetables and seafood. To anyone looking in, it would have seemed like the picture of harmony. But under the surface, everything was off-kilter. He didn't speak much during the meal. Neither did I. We exchanged no glances, no comments, but the silence between us was loaded. My husband, oblivious, scrolled through his emails while chewing. My sister talked about planning a short sailing trip before we left. After dinner, she and her husband began cleaning up. I excused myself and stepped out onto the balcony, needing air. I stood there for a long time, staring at the dark outline of the sea, listening to the rhythm of the waves. It was calming and cruel all at once. Footsteps approached behind me. I knew it was him before he spoke. "I didn't mean for any of this to happen," he said. "Neither did I," I whispered. We didn't touch. We didn't even look at each other. We just stood side by side, not saying another word, while everything around us began to shift in ways we couldn't yet understand. The morning came cloaked in a fog that rolled up from the coast and settled over the villa like a veil. I stood by the kitchen sink, watching it blur the olive trees beyond the patio, making the world seem softer than it really was. My fingers wrapped loosely around a ceramic mug that had gone cold in my hand. Inside the house, everything was quiet. My husband had left early for a call in town. He needed stronger Wi-Fi and more focus. My sister was still asleep. And her husband? I didn't know where he was, and I didn't ask. I should have felt relief. Instead, I felt hollow. I took my tea out to the garden and sat beneath the lemon tree, where the branches stretched overhead like a woven canopy. A few ripe lemons had fallen to the ground, and their skins glistened with early dew. I watched a bee circle lazily, dipping between the grass blades before disappearing. I replayed the walk from the day before over and over, every word and silence burned into my memory. His voice haunted me, not because of what he said, but because of how much it mirrored my own thoughts. He felt stuck. I felt invisible. He didn't know how to stop. I didn't either. Around midday, my sister appeared, barefoot and smiling, carrying a woven basket. "Let's go into town," she said. "They've got new fabric in the market. I want to pick something for the guest room curtains." I told her I wasn't feeling well. It wasn't a lie. My stomach was twisted in on itself. She tilted her head, concerned. "You sure?" "I just need a quiet day," I said. She gave my shoulder a light squeeze and didn't press. Minutes later, I heard her car pulling away, tires crunching over gravel. The house was mine again. I walked back inside, the empty space pressing in around me. The silence wasn't peaceful, it was loaded. I busied myself with small tasks, rinsing fruit, wiping the counters, folding towels that didn't need folding. Anything to keep from thinking. Then came the knock. Soft. Hesitant. I opened the door before I had time to think. He stood there in a linen shirt and sandals, a book tucked under his arm. "She told me you weren't feeling well," he said. I stepped aside without a word. We sat in the shaded part of the patio. He set the book down on the table but didn't open it. I could feel the air shifting between us, warm and pulsing. For a long while, we didn't say anything. And in that silence, I felt myself unraveling. "I shouldn't have come," he said finally. "You did." He nodded slowly, looking out at the garden. "I keep telling myself this will pass. That it's just the setting, the heat, the distance from our real lives. And does it help?" No. We both looked straight ahead, not at each other, but not away either. The weight of what we didn't say sat heavily between us. It wasn't a question of temptation anymore. It was recognition. "I dreamed about you," I said quietly. I hadn't planned to say it. But there it was. He exhaled, his body tightening in his chair. "Don't." But we were already too far gone. "We kissed," I said, and this time I meant now. Not yesterday. Not in the past. We kissed. And it felt like a confession. It wasn't dramatic. There was no sudden rush, no reckless abandon. Just lips meeting with the inevitability of something long delayed. It was the kind of kiss that made time irrelevant. When we parted, I stepped back into myself with a mix of shame and longing that confused me more than ever. He stood, eyes lingering on me for a second longer than they should have. Then he walked away. I remained outside for some time, not trusting myself to return indoors. My pulse pounded in my ears, and my palms were damp. I wanted to cry but couldn't. The tears stayed buried, just like everything else. Later that afternoon, my sister returned, arms full of fabric and bread. I helped her unpack, keeping my face turned from hers whenever possible. She chattered about the baker's new recipe and a street musician playing old jazz standards near the square. I nodded in the right places. Laughed when she did. That evening, we decided to have a simple meal, cold pasta, olives, fresh greens. The sun dipped low as we ate on the terrace. The wine flowed, and my husband was unusually animated, recounting some minor drama from his co-working space. My sister asked about dinner the next night. Should we do something special? Her husband said nothing. Just lifted his glass and took a long sip. I could barely swallow. When the meal ended, I excused myself early, claiming I was tired. I passed through the hallway, brushing my fingers along the rough plaster of the wall, grounding myself. Inside the bedroom, I sat on the edge of the bed, trying to breathe. Every part of me felt exposed, like I'd been peeled back layer by layer until nothing private remained. I heard the voices of the others outside, light laughter, plates being stacked, a bottle being uncorked. I wanted to rewind the last few days. Not because I regretted them entirely, but because I no longer knew who I was inside them. Later that night, my husband joined me in bed. He kissed my forehead in a gesture that felt more like obligation than affection. I stared at the ceiling as he settled in beside me. "Tomorrow," he said sleepily, "we should take a boat ride. Just the two of us." I didn't answer right away. "Maybe," I said. But the truth was, I had no idea how to be alone with him anymore without remembering what it felt like to be seen by someone else. The villa was unusually quiet that morning, not in a peaceful way, but in the way that precedes something unspoken. I sat in the living room, slowly flipping through an old magazine left on the coffee table, the words and images blending together into meaningless noise. My husband had gone off early again, something about a conference call he didn't want to take with spotty Wi-Fi. My sister was tending to something in the garden, her soft humming barely audible through the open doors. And he was somewhere in the house. The thought alone made my hands feel unsteady, though they showed no visible tremble. After what had happened, there should have been distance. There should have been avoidance. Instead, there was stillness. A waiting. I busied myself in the kitchen, cleaning dishes that were already clean. The act gave my fingers something to do, my body something to occupy while my mind drifted. Every sound behind me made me flinch. Footsteps. A door. A voice. Eventually, I gave up pretending and wandered out into the yard, walking the garden paths with no destination. The sun had reached its mid-morning height, casting long shadows and warming the stones beneath my feet. I paused by the rosemary bush, crushing a bit between my fingers and breathing in its sharpness. The scent brought me back to my own kitchen at home, to a life that now felt blurred and far away. Then I heard him. His voice was low, directed at my sister, but distinct. He was asking about dinner, whether she needed him to go into town for supplies. She responded with something cheerful, and I turned quickly, heading back into the house before they saw me. I stayed out of sight the rest of the morning. When my sister went out again, this time for errands, I told her I needed to stay behind to finish a few things. My husband wasn't back yet. The villa emptied again. And he didn't leave. He found me in the laundry room, of all places. I was folding towels, methodically, almost aggressively. He stood in the doorway, quiet for a moment before stepping inside. "I thought you'd be gone with her," I said, not looking up. "I wanted to stay." "That's not helping." "I know." We stood in silence, the scent of detergent thick between us. "I don't know how to go back," I said finally, folding a towel in half and pressing the edges sharply. "Neither do I." I turned to face him, hands still gripping the fabric. "I keep telling myself this is a phase. A distraction. But it's not. It's something else. Something worse." He looked down, then back at me. "I think about you all the time," he said, quietly. I hated how much those words undid me. "This has to stop," I said, and I meant it. "I know," he replied, but he didn't move. And neither did I. Later, when we heard the front door open, we both stepped away from each other so fast it was almost ridiculous. I grabbed a stack of towels I didn't need and carried them to the linen closet. I could hear my sister calling out about fish from the market, and I forced a smile as I joined her in the kitchen. She chatted as she unpacked, telling me about a couple she'd run into, someone we both vaguely knew from childhood. I nodded and asked polite questions, but inside I felt like I was pacing against invisible walls. The rest of the day passed slowly. My husband returned just before dinner, tired and distracted. He kissed my cheek absently and went to shower. My sister prepared grilled vegetables and a simple salad. Her husband helped set the table. We all sat outside again. The food was good. The wine was better. The conversation blurred into a rhythmic dance of shared memories and jokes. I laughed when I was supposed to. I made eye contact when expected. I filled my glass more than once. But every time he looked at me, just a glance, no more, I felt something in my chest fold in on itself. After dinner, my husband disappeared into the bedroom, claiming he needed to prepare for a meeting. My sister stayed behind, clearing the table. I offered to help, and together we stacked plates and gathered glasses in silence. "You've been quiet lately," she said at one point, not accusing, just observant. "Just tired," I replied. "It's the heat, maybe." She didn't press. That night, I couldn't sleep. I lay in bed with my eyes open, listening to the slow, steady breath of my husband beside me. I stared at the ceiling, the pattern of light from the window cutting across the room in faint lines. I thought about home, about what waited there. The dishes. The laundry. The calendar full of appointments. The life we'd built and maintained. The version of me that had survived inside that routine. But here I had unraveled. Just before dawn, I slipped out of bed and padded barefoot to the terrace. The air was cool, the sea barely visible in the early gray. I wrapped a blanket around my shoulders and sat in one of the wicker chairs, knees drawn up to my chest. And I waited. I didn't know for what. Perhaps to feel like myself again. Or someone new entirely. The morning after felt different from the very first breath I took. The air had shifted. It wasn't the weather, though the sky was overcast and a breeze curled in from the sea. It was something inside me, like a string had finally snapped. I wasn't sure what had broken, or if it had been holding me together to begin with. But whatever it was, I felt its absence with a strange, hollow clarity. I moved slowly through the house. Every step was deliberate, every glance cautious. My husband was still asleep, his arm flung over the side of the bed, his breathing steady and deep. I watched him for a moment, unsure what I was looking for. A sign. A memory. A reason. There wasn't one. By mid-morning, the house had roused. My sister had already left to meet friends in the village. My husband mentioned something about catching up on emails and said he'd be gone for most of the day. I nodded and smiled like nothing in the world had shifted beneath us. Like I hadn't already decided what I was going to do. I didn't plan it. Not really. It was one of those things that takes shape only after the first step has been taken. And by then, it's already too late. He was in the garden, trimming back a wild vine that had grown over the fence. His shirt was damp with sweat, and he didn't hear me approach until I was nearly beside him. He turned, startled, then looked at me with something unreadable in his expression. "Everyone's gone," I said. He wiped his hands on a towel and stepped closer, not speaking. I didn't know what I expected, guilt, resistance, maybe some final line we wouldn't cross. But when he reached out to tuck a strand of hair behind my ear, everything else blurred into nothing. We spent the night together. I don't need to describe how. That isn't the story I'm telling. It's not about the moment itself, it's about everything around it. The silence that followed. The way the walls of the villa seemed to press in tighter, the air too thick, the shadows heavier. Afterward, I lay awake for hours, watching the slow dance of moonlight on the ceiling. He had fallen asleep beside me briefly, but we both knew it wouldn't last. We were on borrowed time, and we'd spent more than we could afford. When I slipped out of the room, I didn't feel triumphant or fulfilled. I felt weightless. Like a piece of me had been shaken loose and drifted out to sea. I returned to my room just before dawn. My husband was still sleeping, undisturbed, the covers pulled tightly to his chin. I stood in the doorway for a moment, staring at the shape of his body in the half-light, and felt like a stranger in my own life. The next morning was quiet. I moved through the kitchen like I always did, made coffee, sliced fruit, wiped the counter out of habit. No one asked where I had been. No one noticed the way my hands shook when I held my cup. The world continued as if nothing had happened. At breakfast, my sister talked about the art exhibit opening in the village. She wanted us all to go, said it would be a fun change of pace. I agreed. So did my husband. So did he. We rode into town together. 4 people in a car, chatting, smiling, breathing the same air. But I felt like I was watching it all through glass. Detached. Numb. At the gallery, I let myself drift from room to room, pausing only when something caught my eye. A painting of a woman alone at a table. A sculpture of 2 hands not quite touching. A black and white photo of an empty bed. Each one pressed something into me, gently but firmly. He passed behind me once. Our shoulders brushed. It was accidental. Or maybe it wasn't. Later, when we returned to the villa, I excused myself and went to the terrace. I sat in the same wicker chair I'd been sitting in for days now, watching the sea, waiting for it to reveal something I hadn't seen before. But the water was the same. Wide. Restless. Constant. He didn't come to me that evening. We didn't speak again. Not directly. But when we crossed paths, I could feel it, the new silence between us, filled now not with anticipation, but with memory. And consequence. That night, lying beside my husband, I kept my eyes open long after the lights were off. I watched the ceiling as if it might change. As if it might tell me what to do. But it didn't. And neither did I. It rained the next morning, a soft, persistent drizzle that blurred the glass doors and muffled every sound. I stood by the kitchen window, watching droplets gather along the edge of the pergola before falling in slow, heavy beads. The usual stillness of the villa felt deeper in the rain, almost oppressive. No ocean breeze. No birds. Just the hush of gray air pressing in on everything. No one else was awake yet. Or if they were, they hadn't emerged. I stayed there with my mug of tea, both hands wrapped around it as though I needed the weight. It grounded me, reminded me I was still here, still part of this house, this family, this story I no longer knew how to tell. The guilt hadn't come the way I'd expected. Not sharply. Not suddenly. It had crept in like mist, coating everything until I could no longer see clearly. It blurred the difference between what I felt and what I did. Between who I was and who I had become. Eventually, I heard movement behind me. My sister appeared in the doorway in a long cardigan and mismatched socks, her hair pulled into a messy bun. "Rain," she said, rubbing her eyes. I nodded. "Looks like it." "Good excuse to stay in," she added, pouring herself coffee. We didn't speak after that. She padded back toward her room, cup in hand, already retreating into her own slow morning. I was grateful for the silence. He came into the kitchen not long after. His shirt was damp, as if he'd stepped outside before realizing it was raining. He shook the water from his sleeves and gave me a nod that I returned, and that was it. Nothing more. Just that small exchange, stripped of everything. We spent most of the day scattered throughout the villa. My sister read in the den, my husband spent hours on a call in the bedroom, and I moved between rooms like a ghost. I organized drawers that didn't need organizing. Rearranged chairs that were perfectly fine. Anything to avoid sitting still. Around noon, the rain stopped. The sky didn't clear, but the gray lifted enough to make the world visible again. My sister suggested we all take a walk into the hills behind the villa. Just to stretch our legs, she said. The air will feel good. No one argued. We dressed in layers and stepped onto the muddy trail behind the garden. The path curved gently through olive groves and low stone walls, winding toward the hills where the trees grew denser. The ground was slick and uneven, and we walked mostly in silence, each of us wrapped in our own thoughts. I stayed beside my sister. My husband was ahead, stepping carefully around puddles, occasionally calling back about which direction to take. Her husband, he lingered behind. I didn't look back, but I felt him there, always within reach. At one point, we paused to rest beneath a large oak. My sister pulled out a small thermos and offered tea to everyone. We drank quietly, the steam curling up into the damp air. My husband sat on a low stone and began telling a story from work. Something about a client, a deadline, a clever solution he'd come up with. His voice was confident, animated. I tried to listen, but my focus kept drifting, to the way his foot tapped nervously against the rock, to the way his voice pitched when he tried to sound impressive. I looked at him and realized something painful. I didn't know if I liked him anymore. Not just in the way wives fall out of love, but in the deeper sense of knowing someone and wanting to know them still. He hadn't done anything wrong. And yet, here I was, halfway up a hill in borrowed boots, wondering when I'd stopped wanting to be seen by him. He stood up then and gestured for the group to keep moving. My sister led the way, cheerful despite the mud. I hesitated before falling into step behind them. He remained behind me. As we descended the trail, the villa came back into view, white walls against the green slope, framed by trees and quiet. It looked peaceful. Untouched. As if nothing within it had changed. But I knew better. Back inside, we all changed out of our damp clothes and gathered for a late lunch. My sister set out soup and bread. It felt domestic, ordinary. The kind of meal that marked time without fanfare. After we ate, my husband retreated to the study to finish a proposal. My sister began prepping vegetables for dinner. I dried the dishes. He stood in the corner of the kitchen, polishing glasses. The room was full, but I felt lonelier than I had in days. That evening, we all sat on the terrace again. The rain had cleared, leaving the air fresh and the ground dark and heavy. My sister lit candles. My husband poured wine. Conversation floated easily between them. And then, as the sun dipped low behind the hills, my sister turned to me and asked, "You're quiet. Everything okay?" I nodded. Smiled. "I'm just tired," I said. She studied me for a moment, her expression unreadable. Then she nodded and passed the bread. We stayed there long after the sun disappeared. The villa hummed around us, voices, cutlery, laughter that never quite reached my chest. And I knew, somewhere beneath the layers of ritual and politeness, that the weight of what had happened between him and me was no longer something I could pretend away. The silence between us wasn't neutral anymore. It was a threat. The next day began with a peculiar quiet. The kind of silence that isn't just the absence of sound, but the weight of things unspoken. It pressed against the walls of the villa, filled the corners of rooms, and followed us like a shadow. I dressed slowly, listening to the creak of wood beneath my feet, the distant clink of breakfast dishes, the soft rustle of wind moving through the trees outside. My sister was in the kitchen when I entered, humming faintly as she poured juice into glasses. She looked up and smiled in a way that made something twist in my stomach: warmth, familiarity, trust. It made me want to disappear. She told us we'd been invited by a neighbor for drinks that evening. "Very casual," she said, waving a hand. "They just renovated their terrace. Apparently it has this incredible sunset view." I agreed before I even realized I had. My husband nodded from behind his laptop. He was seated at the far end of the table, already immersed in work, his coffee growing cold beside him. I hadn't told him anything about what had happened. I never would. That decision had cemented itself in me like stone. The hours passed slowly. We all kept busy in separate ways. I reorganized drawers, folded clothes that didn't need folding, wiped down already clean surfaces. My hands needed a task, something to focus on besides the growing tension inside me. I couldn't escape the sense that I was waiting for something. Not a confrontation, not even forgiveness, just something to happen. That afternoon, I stepped outside and walked alone to the edge of the cliff that overlooked the sea. The waves were calm, stretching toward the horizon in shimmering bands of silver and blue. I sat on a bench built into the rock, letting the wind pull at my hair, letting the salt sting my eyes. And then I saw them, my sister and him, walking the garden path below, deep in conversation. She was laughing at something, her body leaning toward his in the way people do when they feel close. He was listening, nodding, but his eyes lifted once, catching mine from the distance. He didn't react. Not visibly. But the moment lasted too long. When I returned to the house, the tension followed. Every door felt heavier, every hallway tighter. My sister mentioned we should leave for the neighbor's house around 6. "Wear something light," she said. "It's warm up there even after sunset." Dinner came and went in a blur of polite chatter and wine. The neighbor's terrace was indeed beautiful, stone pillars, low walls, cushions strewn along benches, and a view that swallowed the sky. I stood near the edge most of the evening, nursing a drink I barely tasted. My husband talked to a man about fishing. My sister chatted with the hostess. And he moved through the space like a ghost I could feel more than see. At one point, someone passed around a camera to take group pictures. We all stood together, smiling stiffly, the lens capturing a moment that would never reflect what it actually was. When it came time to leave, I felt relief in my spine. We walked back slowly, a procession of silhouettes moving through moonlit paths. My sister walked ahead with my husband, their conversation soft and full of domestic ease. I lagged behind, and so did he. It wasn't intentional, but it wasn't accidental either. Just before we reached the villa gates, I felt him close behind me. Not touching. Not speaking. Just there. My heart quickened, and I hated that it did. Inside, my sister kissed me on the cheek and went to her room. My husband disappeared into the guest bedroom, saying something about needing to finish up a few things before bed. I stood in the hall for a moment, unmoving. Then I turned and walked toward the garden door. He was already outside. I didn't call to him. I didn't need to. He turned when he heard the door click shut behind me. We stood a few paces apart. Neither of us spoke. "I think she knows," I said at last. He didn't ask who. He didn't need to. I've seen the way she looks at me lately. The way she hesitates before asking questions. Like she wants to say something but doesn't know how to start. "She hasn't said anything to me," he replied. "That doesn't mean she doesn't know." He shifted his weight. "Do you regret it?" I didn't answer immediately. "I regret that it had to be a secret," I said. "That it had to hurt someone." A long silence passed. "We can't keep this up," I added. "Whatever it is, whatever it was, it can't continue." He nodded. "I know." I looked down at my hands. "But it's not gone either. It's still here." "I know that too." The wind picked up slightly, rustling the tall grass beyond the trees. I wrapped my arms around myself and stared out into the dark. "I'm leaving tomorrow," I said. His eyes flicked toward mine. "Alone?" he asked. "With him," I replied. And for the first time since everything began, I saw something crack in his face, some small loss, some private grief. I don't know what I'm going back to, I continued. But it can't be this. I can't look her in the eye and keep lying. I can't sit across from him and keep pretending. He nodded again, but this time it was slower. He wasn't agreeing. He was accepting. We stood there for a long time after that, the silence between us no longer thick with tension, but heavy with ending. Nothing dramatic. No final gesture. No tearful goodbye. Just two people who had crossed a line they couldn't uncross, standing at the edge of a truth neither one of us wanted to speak aloud. When I finally went inside, I didn't look back. I closed the door gently, as if it might make the goodbye easier. It didn't. We left the next morning. There was no dramatic packing, no final glances, no quiet moments of contemplation in the garden. It was all routine, the kind of preparation that happens when a vacation ends and real life begins again. The kind where everyone keeps busy to avoid emotion. My husband zipped his suitcase with practiced efficiency, checking his phone between folds of clothing. My sister prepared us a quick breakfast, toast, soft-boiled eggs, fruit, and placed it neatly on the table as if nothing at all had happened. I noticed how she didn't meet my eyes when she poured the coffee. I noticed how her voice stayed light, how she asked us about our travel plans with a touch too much brightness. I noticed that she didn't mention her husband once. He wasn't there. That fact hung in the air like a thread pulled too far. My husband didn't ask where he was. He didn't seem to notice. He rarely paid attention to absences, as long as the framework of things remained in place. We ate quietly, my sister and I sitting across from each other. I watched her hands as she peeled an orange, fingers moving with habitual grace. I thought of all the years we'd spent building this version of sisterhood, shared memories, family dinners, little traditions passed down and reshaped. And now, beneath that delicate structure, a fracture. When it was time to leave, she walked us to the car. The sun was already high, casting long shadows across the gravel driveway. The suitcase wheels rattled as they rolled, and each sound felt louder than it should have. "I'll call when we land," I said, hugging her. She nodded, then stepped back. "Drive safe." She hugged my husband too. Briefly. Politely. Then she turned and walked back toward the house, her back straight, her pace even. I wanted to say something else, anything that would close the space that had opened between us, but the words didn't form. Instead, I got into the car, closed the door, and watched the villa grow smaller in the rearview mirror. The drive to the airport was quiet. My husband responded to a few emails. I stared out the window, counting trees, trying not to let my thoughts drift too far. Every bend in the road, every familiar curve of coastline felt like a goodbye I didn't know how to make properly. I wasn't just leaving a place, I was leaving a version of myself I hadn't expected to find. And couldn't take home. At the terminal, we moved through security, checked our bags, waited at the gate. Everything proceeded as it always did, every step clicking into place with mechanical precision. But inside me, something felt misaligned. A gear slipping out of rhythm. On the plane, my husband took the aisle seat and opened his laptop. I sat by the window and tried to breathe through the hum of pressurized air. I closed my eyes, but rest didn't come. Images flooded my thoughts, her face, his voice, the garden at night, the way silence had started to mean more than words. When we landed, the city greeted us with noise and motion. Taxi horns. Rolling suitcases. Crowds moving with purpose. I followed him to the curb, got into the car, and gave directions home. The streets looked the same, but I didn't. At least not to myself. We stepped back into our apartment, and the air smelled of old furniture and the faint mustiness of absence. He dropped his bags by the door and stretched. "Good to be home," he said. I nodded, taking in the familiar shapes, the framed photos, the tidy bookshelf, the mugs still drying beside the sink. Everything was in its place. Everything unchanged. Except me. The following days passed in a haze of logistics, emails, laundry, grocery lists. We moved in parallel, sharing space but not conversation. My husband resumed his schedule as though we'd never left. I answered messages from friends with brief replies. I didn't call my sister. I couldn't. One morning, I sat in the kitchen with my coffee, watching the light spill across the floor in long, golden beams. The silence felt different here. Not heavy, not dangerous, just empty. It didn't hide anything. It simply existed. I looked around the room and thought about everything that had unraveled without ever making a sound. The moments that had built up and collapsed inside me. The way love had shifted, not just for him, or for her, or for the man I could never name aloud, but for myself. I had wanted to be seen. And I was. But now I had to look, too, to see what I had done, what I had lost, and what I might have become. That afternoon, I finally opened the window. The air was warm and still. I picked up the phone and held it for a long time. Not dialing. Just holding. Maybe I'd call her tomorrow. Maybe not. I didn't know what I would say. There was no version of the truth that didn't hurt. No explanation that made the story clean again. But silence was no longer an escape. It was only distance. I set the phone down gently and went to open the curtains. Light filled the room. Dust floated in the beam like tiny stars. And for the first